if you had to operate that long to clean up the fish, why you did. You've only got so much time to get them because they don't wait.
The creature that lured so many men to the Alaskan frontier is a fish that engages in one of nature's most remarkable fertility rituals. Spawned in the gravels of freshwater creeks, mature salmon make their way back to the same waters where they were born. These returning spawners are bruised and worn. Soon, after planting the seeds of the next generation, they will die. When they reach the spawning area, the salmon pair off and dig shallow depressions in the stream bed. Each female lays thousands of eggs, which are fertilized by the male and covered with gravel for protection. The female expends her dying breaths, fighting off intruders. The eggs develop throughout the winter months, and hatching occurs in late winter or early spring. When they are big enough to survive the journey, the young salmon migrate seaward. Little is known about their lives at sea, where they spend from 2 to 6 years before returning home. One thing is known for certain. From the times when the Tlingit and Haida were the only people in the region, the salmon runs of southeast Alaska have spawned a frenzy of human effort each summer, as flotillas of people and equipment rush to greet them. In the early years, fish traps were the principal means of supplying the canneries with fish. Fish traps had long been used by native Alaskan fishermen, but trap technology was perfected by the salmon canners, who created elaborate structures constructed from pilings driven into the seafloor. Each trap featured a long line of pilings called the lead that stretched across a known salmon migration route. When the fish encountered the obstruction, they had two choices. They could either swim ashore or turn seaward, directly into the trap. Trapmen still argue that the traps represented the finest method ever devised for catching salmon. Captured fish propelled themselves into the spiller, the deepest part of the trap that would become their final watery home. Trapfish bore no marks of struggle with hooks or nets. Freshness was assured because the fish were alive when the lifting crews brailed them into tenders for the short run to a nearby cannery. To fish the deep waters of southeast Alaska, the industry devised the floating trap. The first floater was patented in 1907 by James Robert Heckman, one of Ketchikan's founding fathers. His device caught 400,000 salmon in its first 24 days of operation. Floating traps were constructed on the beach by crews that had mastered the intricate art of building log frames and suspending the wire traps. They did the work at low water, then simply floated the traps to the fishing location when the tide was high. Men known as trap watchmen spent lonely summers in tiny shacks tending the fishing operations. Roy Berg, who later became caretaker at the George Inlet Cannery, began his career as a Ketchikan area trap watchman at a tender age.
I was 14 years old. It was in 1933. I had begged my mother to please let me go, and she was very hesitant. I finally got her to say okay. I grabbed my seed bag, my clothes, and run like heck down to the tender, but they had some engine troubles, so they didn't leave right away. So I hid up into the forecastle and didn't really relax until I heard that engine going, and they threw the lines off, and we were out in the channel. And we get out to Rose Inlet, Prince of Wales Island, and from there they took me out to the trap. There was only one watchman on it then, and I thought he was quite an old man because he probably wasn't over 30. It was quite rough, and the water was coming over the traps, and I was plenty nervous. They unloaded me and my gear off of there, got up to the trap shack, and it was dry up there, so I relaxed a little bit. And the guy was so nice to me, and I was a cook and dishwasher, and he took care of the outside work, and I had a very pleasant summer there.
Traps were expensive to build and operate. and soon the best trap sites were property of the cartels and conglomerates that dominated the industry. While the traps were indisputably effective, they were despised by the residents of territorial Alaska. Traps had become the symbols of what Alaskans viewed as a colonial empire bent on usurping their resources. Their enmity led to piracy. The trap pirates discovered that you didn't have to own traps to brail trap fish in the dark of night. Locals regarded them somewhat like Robin Hoods, who robbed from the salmon industry for the sake of the poor Alaskans. Ketchikan resident Ben Fleener admits that hard times and the dominance of the traps forced local fishermen to resort to night operations.
It got that bad that if you were going to pay your oil bill, the fuel bill for the boat, you had to do something besides troll. So some of us, and myself included, we approached one of the fish traps and approached the watchman. Some we knew, make a deal with them where we would, in my case, I always split the difference. We would make arrangements to buy their fish. We could, and then we would, whatever we got, we split with them. You know, it was what's fair is fair deal. They were running a risk and we were running a risk.
Sometimes the night work proved dangerous.
We had some rather hairy experiences. One of them was the night we were working on the Chesina Point trap. And it was blowing a little bit, and we just got tied up and we were going to put the brailer in the spiller, and my deckhand, Fred Evanson, he looked up and he said, "Expletive deleted." "Let's tie loose," he said. "Here comes a boat." And we looked up, and all I saw was this white wall of water coming at us. And so we let go of the lines in a hurry, and I kicked it in gear and full speed. And I looked back, and here was this wall of water, and I could see Karluk, I think as I remember was the name of the boat. No lights. He had no lights on. He was coming down right on our stern, and the bone in the teeth of the ship was higher, twice, three times as high as the stern of our boat, the little Gunver. Fred looked back, and his eyes were big as saucers, and he says, "You got a spotlight?" And I fortunately had a spotlight. He grabbed that and turned our spotlight into the pilot house of the Karluk and said, "Head for the beach." So just rounded the corner of the trap and headed right up for the shallows in the beach. Well, Karluk couldn't afford to follow us, so he just kept going. But we had rather weak knees for a while after that little episode. So.
Berg was on the other side of the trap robbing equation.
I worked for Clarence Payne, and we were on Prince of Wales Island, across from Gravina. And I had about 5,000 fish in the trap, and Clarence didn't come by. He had a boat called the Confidence at that time, and he didn't come by to brail. And here in the middle of the night, this was about 1937, I woke up, and there was a boat out there, and they were lifting the spillers. So I told my partner, he was an older man, but I was head watchman. So I told him to stay inside, and I ran out, and I argued with these guys. And there were 5 or 6 of them, something like that there. And they convinced me they were going to take the fish whether I liked it or not. If I didn't like it, I was going to overboard. So they took the fish. But it made me so mad. When Clarence came out, I told him what happened. And we were pretty sure who it was. But I asked him to bring me a gun and some bullets. So he did. And I was so glad that nobody ever showed up again, because I wouldn't want it on my conscience to hurt anybody over a few salmon.
To maintain a constant supply of salmon for its southeast Alaska canneries at George Inlet, Taku, Craig, and Yakutat, Libby's also operated a fleet of purse seiners. Seining is a traditional harvesting technique in which the fishing vessel deploys a small mesh net, or seine, in its wake. While the fishing vessel speeds forward in an effort to encircle the fish, the skiff secures the trailing end of the net. When the seiner completes the circle, crewmen take both ends of the net aboard to entrap the fish in a cylinder of web. Briefly, the netting is bottomless, and the fishermen work quickly to close the hold before the fish can escape. They haul in the purse line that passes through a series of rings lashed to the bottom of the net and acts like a drawstring. As the purse line grows tighter and tighter, the bottom of the net is gathered together to form an impenetrable hemisphere of web that hangs beneath the boat. Now, the fish are truly imprisoned, and the crew can brail them into the hold in a more leisurely fashion. George S. James is a Ketchikan seine fisherman who started out as a boy on his father's boat. He remembers George Inlet in its heyday.
You could see the steam coming out of the retorts and the smoke coming out of the stacks that were heating up the retorts that cooked the salmon, and you could hear the steam whistles blowing. It was quite a sound, nice sound to hear. You know, you can hear the whistles echoing in the channels and the mountaintops. You could hear the echoes, the whistle. You know, it's like a train coming, only it was stationary. You could hear that for miles and miles away. It was quite a sound, quite a nice sound to hear, because you know, people were busy and salmon was being canned.
In the old days, hauling the seine was strictly a manual operation.
Everything was done by hand power. And you could feel when somebody was cheating. If somebody was cheating, wasn't pulling their share, you could feel like an extra 100 pounds of weight was put on your shoulders. All of a sudden somebody would say, hey, all right, who's the wise guy? Then you could feel, you know, the burden taken off your shoulder and then shared equally with the other crew members.
After he became skipper of his own boat, James conceived a unique method of motivating his crew.
You have to be strong. And one way I used to check my crew members out, if a guy wasn't putting out like he should, I would take and wrestle him. I'd say, let's wrestle. And a lot of times, a good portion of the time, I'd pin the guy, and I know I'd have to use everything I had got to pin him. Then I'd say, all right, what's your excuses? You're just about strong as me, or maybe you're even stronger than me. What's holding you back? There's no excuse after that.
Whether captured by seine or trap, the fish met a common fate. As noted in one early news report,
salmon used to be butchered by Chinamen, but a machine has been invented which takes the place of the Chinaman and has therefore been given the name of the iron chink. This machine is a marvelous piece of mechanism and butchers the salmon at the rate of 60 per minute.
The iron chink made such an impact on the salmon industry of the day that one early cannery tycoon described it as nothing less than the most important machine ever invented. The butchered fish passed along conveyors, first to the sliming table where they were washed, then to the feed table where the mechanical fingers fed them into the filler machine. The filler machine cut the fish to size and inserted the requisite amount of meat into each can, along with a 1/4 ounce of salt for each 16-ounce tall. The cans received the human touch at patching tables, where they were scrutinized for proper fill and purity. The cans were sealed, a vacuum was introduced, they were washed and arranged on iron trays called coolers, which were piled on trucks, and wheeled on rails to the retorts, where they were steam processed. Finally, they were cooled, lacquered to prevent rust, and labeled.
There was a lot of fish back then. A lot of fish. The canneries, I can remember the scow loads by the scow loads that they were bringing into the canneries, and I wonder how they can so fast. In fact, the women had to work almost around the clock to keep that fish from spoiling. And you have to get a lot of credit for this cannery workers, the women, local women, that a lot of them worked in the cannery. And it was a lot of effort on their part. And catching it is not too, it's pretty hard, but it's even harder to stand on your legs 20 hours a day trying to process this fish.
Them days we had a lot of fish. Of course, their season was very short. Sometimes we'd start canning at 6 o'clock in the morning, and we'd run until midnight, 1, 2 o'clock the next morning. So sleep was dear. We got 3, 4 hours of sleep, then we were back at it again. And this was during the heavy period of fishing. They had 6 meals a day. They had breakfast, and then they had mug up at 10 o'clock, and 12 o'clock they had lunch, and 3 o'clock they had another, the mug up. There was a coffee break that they had took for about 15 minutes, and they'd go out and have their coffee and cakes and sandwiches. Then we'd have dinner. Then at 9 o'clock they'd have another break, a mug-up break. And if they worked beyond midnight, why, those that wanted were entitled to a hot meal at the mess hall.
In its heyday, Ketchikan was the site of some 13 canneries, stretching from Ward's Cove to George Inlet. Canneries that produced over 1 million cases of salmon a year, in the era before the advent of high-speed canning machinery. In the modern era, the salmon industry has undergone dramatic changes. Alaska voters banned fish traps with the passage of the Statehood Act in the late 1950s, and the Southeast Alaska salmon harvest became the sole province of the independent fishermen who endure to the present day. Without the sure supply of cheap fish once provided by its network of trap sites, Libby McNeil Libby closed the George Inlet Cannery in 1957. Roy and Amy Berg had moved to George Inlet that same year, expecting to become the resident employees of a functioning cannery. Instead, they became the caretakers of a remote storage site for fishing gear that would no longer pulse with the energy of the salmon harvest.
I read a lot and I knitted a lot. We didn't have a lot of company, and that was fine. We enjoyed it. And I do remember that there were any number, I never kept track, but there were any number of men that come out and visit us for one reason or another, workmen or fishermen or something, and they say, "Oh, I wish my wife would live in a place like this."
If the George Inlet Cannery is now the stuff of history, however, the salmon industry remains the lifeblood of Ketchikan.
Ketchikan, it was a salmon capital of the world. It's been that way from, I'd say, from as long as I can remember. And I know we were proud of that fact, and I think it's still the salmon capital of the world.
And I think there'd be a future in canned salmon forever. You get a salmon in a can, why, it's preserved, and it's good for a few years. So I think the canned salmon industry is still got a bright future ahead.
And as long as there are salmon, men will gather along Alaska's coast to greet them. For some reason, this business of fishing engages its practitioners with an intensity that characterizes few other professions.
It's infectious, I guess. I don't know. There's just something to going out and seeing if you're going to get the fish and then getting them. You know, when we go north, we don't know if we're going to get any fish. And we start buying the fish, oftentimes we don't know what we're paying for them. And when we do pay for them, we don't know what we're going to sell them for, if we're going to sell them at all. To a lot of people that haven't grown up in it, it doesn't seem very sensible, and I guess maybe it's not. But it's not a business that lends itself very well to conventional management techniques. This is not something where MBAs do well. You can't measure it. And when you're sitting there waiting for the fish to come, and there's nothing you can do about it, they're either going to show up or they aren't. And then once they do, why, everybody knows that they're only going to be there for a few days, so there's no time for anything other than catching and processing fish. And all else becomes totally irrelevant and unimportant. So I guess that's what it's all about.